Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Nigel Biggar, who is a professor emeritus of moral theology at Oxford, also the author of a number of books, one called In Defense of War, another one called What's Wrong with Rights. I have sort of a samizdat copy of it here, Between Kin and Cosmopolis, An Ethic of the Nation, Behaving in Public, and this latest book called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Welcome, Nigel.
Thanks, Greg. Glad to be with you.
Now, I guess you could have had a subtitle for this book called something like Two Cheers for Colonialism, right? I mean, it's really, when we say moral reckoning, I mean, it's really looking at kind of the pros and the cons from a moral perspective, and which sounds, I guess, unusual to a lot of people, I think, nowadays. But the major question I think a lot of people would ask is, what are you doing writing history books as a theologian, right? Theologians are supposed to focus on things like good and evil. And, historians, at least, on the officially will profess that that's not their domain. That's not their business. Their business is trying to understand and figure out what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and so forth. And they leave theology to the theologians, and maybe theologians should leave history to the historians. So why does it make sense for someone who is an expert in moral theology to do all this historical writing?
First of all, just on the matter of qualifications, Greg, my first degree was in history, although I moved into theology and ethics afterwards. As for why I'm doing ethics on historical turf, you're right. Historians are not professionally competent to do that. But when historians, particularly now, when they write about slavery or colonialism, you will rarely find them writing without making strong moral judgments. Sometimes because they're historians, they don't know they're making them, and they often lack any kind of capacity for much critical self-reflection. But I've spent my professional career thinking about issues of good and bad, right and wrong, as the list of my books that you recited earlier indicates. I've sought to address complicated practical problems. Another one that I took on around the turn of the century in 2003 or so was the issue of making peace and doing justice after civil conflict in South Africa, in Northern Ireland. How do you square the circle between the requirements of justice and making peace? So I've long had a strong interest in trying to make moral sense of complicated moral practical questions. And of course, because colonialism has become such a hot, incendiary, combustible topic, and because I think colonial history has become politically important, I wanted to push back against the recently dominant narrative, and I say recently, I mean the last 6-7 years, dominant narrative that European colonialism is nothing but a litany of racism and exploitation and oppression. And just to make clear why I'm doing this, it is because of its political importance, because I think actually what's at stake in the history of colonialism is the record of the West, and that's what's under attack. So that's why I have dared to trespass on historians' turf, and I have to say some of them seem to resent it. When they complain, I simply remind them that this is an ethical analysis in which I'm competent and they're not.
So I think you'd argue that most historians are effectively making moral judgments, but they're doing it maybe less explicitly and being
yes,
sort
I
of
think
less.
that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, my sense is, in the recent past, there has been an ideal of historiography in which you try and put your political moral views aside and try and describe what happened and try and describe what happened perhaps in terms that the people involved in what happened understood what was happening. So in other words, you really encounter a very different perspective on the world, and the idea was to lay aside contemporary judgments. But certainly some historians I've read recently, not all of them, but some of them, and more broadly in society, yours and mine, non-professional historians, I mean, people who are not professional historians, have taken very, very strong moral views against colonialism, or against what they perceive to be the truth about colonialism. And in a sense, I don't complain about that, because my book, as I'm quite frank in saying, was written for political reasons. And I lay out what the reasons were in the introduction, so no reader can make any doubt why I'm doing this. And I do make moral judgments, and I seek to make them I seek to explain how I reach the judgment as clearly as possible, so a reader can follow what I say, why I say it, and if they wish to disagree, then they can. The problem with, as it were, the problem with historians, activist historians, making moral judgments is, as I said earlier, that they, I mean, we all have moral opinions about all sorts of things, which is fine. But when, as it were, historians make moral judgments about colonialism, about slavery, etc., they do so with the mantle of the authority of historians, but their moral judgments, from my point of view, I really have no more authority than that of the ordinary person. So what I've sought to do is I'm not an historical expert. Therefore, in what I've written, I've had to depend on what other historians have written. Now, of course, historians differ on all sorts of issues. And so on particularly controversial matters, I've taken care to read more than one historian, and the reader can see how I negotiate between the different interpretations. And again, the reader can make up her own mind as to how well I've done. But I do think it's particularly on issues like colonialism and slavery, which are held to continue to have a deleterious effect on the world we live in. It's important to make moral judgments, but it's important to make good ones, not rather than bad ones.
Well, there's a lot of controversy around what is called presentism, right? Which is looking at the past through the lens of contemporary concerns.
Yes.
I don't think you would deny that you are, in part, doing something just like that. Is that avoidable in history? I mean, it seems like the reasons why we study history, the reason why we put so much emphasis on history and why it's so important to us is because we're trying to make meaning of the past to some degree. Is it possible to do history that is not presentist to some degree?
Um, Greg, I agree that. Well, I agree and disagree. I think on reflection, I mean, I've gone back and forth with this in my own mind quite a bit. So I think on reflection, it is possible for an historian. It's possible for any of us actually, as it were, to bring to mind what our moral convictions are, and as it were, be self-conscious about them, and as it were, put them aside in trying to understand how on earth it was that our ancestors 250 years ago were involved in slave trading and slavery, and how on earth it was that not just our ancestors, but the ancestors of Africans and Comanche and Maori were all involved in slave trading and slavery. So we can do that. However, yeah. So I think one can, as it were, be clinical in trying to understand the past and how people behaved in the past. When it comes to making moral judgments about the past, which I think sometimes is perfectly appropriate, some people say, as you suggest, that one shouldn't use the norms of the present to judge the past. Well, when we're in the business of making judgments, we can't help doing that, nor do I. So the reader will find in the introduction to my book a section where I lay out what my moral principles are, again, so the reader can be in no doubt as to where I'm coming from. But I think there are good judgments about the past one can make in terms of one's own morals, bad ones. And I think part of a good judgment is that one has to take into account that circumstances in the past were very different, right? So people like you and I, living in the United States and the UK in the early 21st century, we have not experienced war on our own turf. In the UK, not since 1746. In the UK, it's not since the 1860s. We live in, broadly speaking, societies that enjoy unprecedented health, wealth, and security. We live under strong states, which on the whole control crime and violence around us. So we're used to societies where the use of violence within our society is minimal, historically speaking. So when we come to judge the use of violence by our ancestors 200 years ago, 200 years ago, on the American frontier or the Australian frontier, we have to bear in mind that our ancestors lived in a generally highly insecure environment. If our ancestors were European, they were confronted with Native American peoples, very different in culture, different language, different norms. And when two very different peoples encounter each other in those circumstances, there's a high degree of anxiety and insecurity and uncertainty and mistrust, and recourse to violence in defense or in revenge is ready. And we can look back and judge certain instances where, let's say, European colonists were excessively violent, and the case of the Puritan attack on the Native American village Mystic in, where was that, Connecticut or Massachusetts in the 1600s, fellow Puritans and Native Americans who were present were appalled at the excess in violence. So even at the time, people recognized excessive violence. But compared to our circumstances, theirs were very insecure and recourse to violent self-defense. And often, of course, self-defense will take the form of preemptive aggression. We need to put ourselves in those shoes before we judge what violence was excessive. So it's partly a matter of taking into account very different circumstances. And any good judgment, moral judgment, needs to do that, whether we're judging something that happened yesterday or something that happened 200 years ago. The other thing is we do need to have a certain amount of humility about the fact that some moral things that are obvious to us, like the ownership of one human being by another, where the human being who is owned has no rights whatsoever, which is slavery, that's obviously wrong to us. But the fact of the matter is, it was not obviously wrong to human beings for millennia. And slavery in the 1700s. Yes, Europeans had been involved in slave trading from West Africa to the Americas, well, first of all to Portuguese possessions in Europe and the Atlantic from the 1440s until the 1800s. But the fact of the matter is that slave trading and slavery had been had been occurring on every continent by people of every skin colour. In the 1700s, according to one historian, the Comanche ran, and I quote, a vast slave economy in the southwest of what's now the US. Everyone was doing it. When I was in Raleigh, North Carolina in January last year visiting my wife's family, I visited the Museum of the History of the State of North Carolina, discovered that on the eve of the US Civil War in 1860, there were 30,000 freed slaves in North Carolina, some of whom kept black slaves of their own. So common was the practice. Now that may perplex us, but we have to understand that for whatever reason, the moral understanding of people 200 years ago was not ours, and it may well be, and I think it's true, we are more enlightened than they. But it took us a while to get here, and we can be quite sure that in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, our descendants will wonder at how we were so morally stupid on certain matters. So a certain amount of sensitivity to circumstance, and also a certain humility in terms of general moral common sense. It takes time to develop.
Well, it seems like you could critique work of history in a couple of different ways. One of which is purely factual, right? You could say the factual claims that are being made are false, or the selection of facts in the historical work are skewed, non-representative, or biased in order to support a particular position. And that seems like a critique that's separate from the moral evaluation of the actions described in the work. And it seems like you're interested in kind of doing both, right? Looking to correct some of the factual claims as well as sort of critiquing the moral judgments. So for instance, when you talk about the dump roads movement, which I think gathered a lot of force in both South Africa and the UK, you could say the claims that were made about Rhodes were incorrect. He didn't say the things they said he said, and there were things that he said that were left out or something like that. And that would seem like a separate critique from saying, okay, facts are correct. Now, how do we judge the man?
Yeah, you're right. It involves both operations. So, just to take one example, in relation to Rhodes, he is quoted as saying at one point, we must kill all the insert N word. We can. So kill all black Africans we can. Right? Therefore, Rhodes was genocidal. Okay. Did Rhodes say that? There is certainly a report that he did. So was he genocidal? Well, let's look at the context. This wasn't a kind of a general statement made in his armchair sitting in Cape Colony about how Europeans should treat Africans in general. This was in the middle of a battle fought between the British and the Ndebele in, I think, 1893. Oh, no, 1893 or 6, one of those two. And what had happened was some of the members of the British South Africa Company had a clash with Ndebele, and the British had allowed the Ndebele to withdraw. And Rhodes said, well, don't do that, because if you're merciful in that respect, all they're going to do is regroup and come back again. So you need to kill all you can. Now, we can quarrel about whether that's a morally legitimate way of waging war. Now, it's not clear to me it's not a legitimate way of waging war. It's one thing, if the enemy have surrendered, one shouldn't harm them because they're no longer a threat. But if they haven't surrendered, then arguably one should do whatever it takes to disable them. But in that context, that's not a genocidal statement. And then you can add other facts, such as the fact that when Rhodes died in 1901, his coffin was carried into the mountains where he wanted to be buried, in what's now Rhodesia. And as the coffin was carried up the hills, several thousand Ndebele warriors stood on the hills and saluted him. And then after he was buried there, his brother negotiated with the Ndebele chieftains and asked them to take care of the grave, which they did for several decades. So that makes it unlikely that Rhodes was. Certainly makes it clear that he wasn't successful if he did intend genocide. Secondly, it makes it unlikely that that was his intention. And in the context of the remark he's alleged to have made, it wasn't a general statement. It had to do with a particular, if you like, military tactic. So there are questions of fact. There's questions of the context of the fact, and then, as it were, what the moral significance of the fact in its context is. So sometimes getting the moral judgment right does mean you need to get the facts right, all the facts in place, in context. Otherwise, you end up with a skewed judgment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you quoted Frantz Fanon, who said that truth is whatever serves the revolution. I mean, do you think that there are historians that see facts as things to be weaponized, or the accuracy of those facts is not their primary concern? I mean, that would be that's a pretty harsh accusation. Do you think that you see much of that in history, or is it more common in sort of the popular interpretation of history?
Well, let's start with what you call popular views. Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of casual abuse of history, or exploitation, if you like, of history in order to make a political point. And those exploiting the facts are not too scrupulous about how they're exploited, just so long as they're politically effective. But it's not just, as it were, ordinary, uneducated citizens who do that. The people clamouring for Rhodes's dismantling in Oxford in 2015-16 were largely graduate students at the University of Oxford, some British, many American, some South African, right? So these are not exactly professional historians yet, or professional academics, but they are on their road to becoming professional academics at one of the world's leading universities. So they too were infected by the exploitation of history for political purposes. And one thing, when this first erupted, I was just perplexed because they made certain claims. I happened to be 2/3 of the way through the long 800-page standard biography of Cecil Rhodes by Robert Rotberg, and I'd already read, or was about to read, several more biographies of Rhodes. And so I knew that some of the claims being made were outlandish. And I published my view of why they were outlandish. And I noticed that 2 years later, when there was another eruption of agitation to have Rhodes fall from his pedestal, the statue over Oxford's High Street, in the Guardian newspaper, one of the student agitators present accused Rhodes of being a génocidaire, genocidal, again. In other words, the evidence I presented made no difference at all, because it seemed to me these folk weren't interested in the truth about history. They were possessed by a certain political conviction. Namely, I think that, I mean, the reason I opposed the dismantling of the statue of Rhodes was not because Rhodes was a saint, he certainly wasn't, but because I perceived what was happening was that a certain reading, a certain misreading, a certain distorted reading of the record of the British Empire, and since the British Empire is a proxy for the West, the record of the West was being projected onto Rhodes' statue. So if Rhodes' statue was dismantled, it would mean the triumph of a distorted reading of the history of the West, and a set of moral judgments about the West that I thought were unfounded. That's why I opposed the dismantling of the statue. But these budding scholars, and many of them were not British, many of them were American and South African, as I say, they didn't care. Yes, do I therefore worry about what happens to their teaching and their research when they carry those attitudes into their academic work? Yes, I do. And since moving on now to currently professional historians, yes, I found several instances of historians with very strong moral political views, which seem to me to be quite distorted by their moral political, the reading of the facts, quite distorted by their moral political views. And in several places in my book, I spend a whole section showing the reader what they say, showing how it doesn't do justice to the evidence. One of them was Dan Hicks, who's a professor of archaeology here at Oxford. Another, mostly in the endnotes of my book, was Caroline Elkins at Harvard. And there are others, Hilary Beckles in the Caribbean too. So these are grown-up professional historians whose moral claims go way ahead of the evidence, and sometimes in defiance of the evidence. Now, I try and ponder at the end of my book what's driving them, because if you go beyond the evidence, do it consistently, something's driving you to do that, and why that is a really interesting question. But certainly, at the proximate level, what's driving you is a certain set of moral political convictions. And I've nothing against moral political convictions, but I do think they need to be disciplined by the truth about the facts.
Well, I mean, is there a particular moral imperative around historical accuracy? I mean, I was trained as an historian, and we had to study historiography, and we had a big emphasis on plagiarism. We had a big emphasis on fabrication of facts, right? So there's a lot of scandals that happened at the time. This is sort of the mid to late 80s, where certain historians were found to be fabricating things. They couldn't, identify their sources and so forth. But I don't recall ever getting any kind of ethics training in the way you get ethics training as a doctor or a lawyer, right? So it doesn't seem like there is any kind of historical ethics. Why do we care if the historical depiction is accurate or not? Shouldn't it just be evaluated in terms of its effect? I mean, think about how important it is for political cultures to forget certain things. If you're trying to have reconciliation between the Francoists and the Republicans in Spain, right? Isn't it better for them just to kind of forget all that stuff and put it behind them and pretend like it never happened? I mean, that would be historical distortion, right?
Yeah. Just on the first issue of, as it were, the ethics of historians, my perception is, until the last few years, and certainly if you look at history written about the British Empire, for example, up until 2015, and I'm thinking particularly of one general accounting of the British Empire by a prominent left-wing historian toward the end of his career. I mean, he's quite scrupulous. Actually, his view
Hobsbawm?
is not much different from. Sorry? No. This
You're
is
talking about Hobsbawm?
no Bernard Porter. Bernard Porter. He wrote a book called British Imperial, which was a fairly slim book, but he was a professional historian of British Empire. His most famous book was called The Absent-Minded Imperialists, arguing that actually the British Empire really didn't feature much in the consciousness of most British people. But he described himself as a man of the left. He's still alive. But he published this book called British Imperial, What the British Empire Wasn't, in 2015-16, and I read it just last year. Man of the left, but his view is not much different from mine. But he's pretty, it's coolly presented. He's not kind of ranting. And my sense is, from what I read, if you read stuff written in the first decade of this century, it's pretty dispassionate. And so I think actually up until recently, it was taken for granted and communicated by doctoral supervisors to their doctoral students that yes, of course, we're in the business of understanding the past and understanding it in their terms, not ours. But there's arisen, I think, a certain generation of historians. I can't say how widespread this view is, that thinks that being activist is where it's at, and certainly in the UK right now, if you want to get funding, if you want to get promotion, if you want to get a job, then you need to toe a certain political line, and if you don't, you risk not getting a career at all, not getting funding, not getting promotion, and that's a recent development. It wasn't there 10 years ago. So I think that has distorted the process. I know that there are young historians who dissent from this political line, but they voice their dissent at risk of their careers. And I have to say I hold an older generation of historians responsible because they're the ones who allowed this to happen. Now, as for the case you present in terms of Spain and the Civil War and the issue of making peace after civil conflict, why don't we just who cares about the facts? Let's forget about the past and make up. Now, that's an important distinction. Distorting the facts is one thing. Forgetting about them is another. And certainly, in terms of political peace after civil conflict, whether in Spain or Ireland after the War of Independence and the Civil War in the 1920s, or Northern Ireland after the Troubles in the 70s to 90s, there are some who say it's better just to forget rather than try and reach some kind of common narrative. And I think, although as a Christian ethicist, I'm all into forgiveness and reconciliation and truth. After
Or to
studying these
create a
things,
false narrative, right? So like the French have a narrative that they were all in the resistance, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
perhaps in the 1950s and 60s they needed that false narrative to create national unity, right? And then it's only kind of later when the stakes are lower that they can revisit these issues and sort out the truth.
Yeah, okay. So the claim, yes, you claim it might. Yes, I guess there are some useful lies one can tell oneself personally and nationally. Um, I guess I'm not willing to endorse the creation of fictions. Um, because they're untrue, and because if they're untrue, then at some point their falsehood will be exposed. I certainly am willing to endorse silence. I remember 20 years ago when I ran a conference on making peace after civil conflict, the former Taoiseach or Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland, Garret Fitzgerald, commented. He said, we in Ireland in the 1990s, for 2 generations, could not talk about the civil war here in the 1920s. Why? Because it would cause families to rupture because it was so explosive. So the moral he drew from this was, we can begin to tell the truth only when all those involved were dead, which is sobering, but it's realistic. But now there's much more open discussion about the past, but it's interesting. The Irish haven't stopped thinking about the past; they talk about it all the time. And I lived there in the early noughties, and I was there for the 90th anniversary of the Easter Rising 1916, and I was fascinated as a Briton to read the letters pages in the Irish Times, which for weeks were consumed with letters obsessed with whether the Easter Rebellion should ever have happened. So I certainly agree that sometimes drawing a veil over the past makes good political sense. Creating fictions about it, no, I don't buy that.
Well, for many of the critics of colonialism, their fundamental problem is the notion that some cultures think of themselves as superior to other cultures, and that they fail to treat those other cultures as equals. But I think you pointed out that this critique is applied across cultures, but it's not applied across time periods. So I was wondering if you could kind of spell out that critique and maybe explain it, why it is that we value this capacity to understand other cultures, but we don't value the capacity to understand other time periods as much.
Yeah, that's a really important question, Greg. So let me start with a distinction. Making a judgment that our culture now is superior to another culture, whether another culture in the form of the culture of our great grandparents, or the culture of another people right now. Making a judgment that ours is superior is one thing. Being arrogant about it and contemptuous of inferior cultures is a separate matter. And of course, arrogance and contempt are immoral. Having said that, it seems to me quite clear that when I, as a 21st century Briton, look at my medieval forebears, I do think that in some respects we are morally superior. We're certainly superior in terms of science and technology and medicine. We don't burn people alive anymore, thank God. So in many respects we are superior. Does that mean that medievals have nothing to teach us? No, it doesn't. Our own culture is not perfect by any means. So there's no problem about making, as it were, moral judgments across our own civilization, across time. But therefore, why would it be inappropriate or wrong for Cecil Rhodes, arriving on the coast of South Africa in 1870, from an industrial Britain at the height of its world power, leading the world in science, technology, finance, naval power, etc., and a developing liberal democracy. When he comes across Bantu people in Africa at that time, did he feel superior? You bet he did. But then he had good reason to, in many respects. But notice I add the qualification in many respects. So I think an indiscriminate blanket condemnation of another culture is usually wrong and unwise, because it is rare that every culture has got it right and every culture has got it wrong. So we need to, as it were, be open to the possibility that other cultures sometimes have something to teach us. But going back to the question of Europeans presuming to tell Africans and Indians and Native Americans how to live their lives. Okay, without a doubt, sometimes, for example, in the residential schools in Canada and no doubt in the US too, well-meaning white teachers, missionary teachers, were excessively contemptuous or dismissive of native culture and religion, and maybe for racist reasons. Maybe they had a generally contemptuous attitude toward natives and their culture, perhaps. Not always, but sometimes. And that's wrong. On the other hand, certainly in Canada, I don't know the US, it was native Canadians who lobbied colonial government for residential schools. Why? Because the material resources for their traditional culture in the 1880s, that was bison. In the 1880s, the bison herd suddenly disappeared because of over-culling. They knew that to survive they had to adapt. And to adapt, they needed English language and they needed settled agriculture. And so they lobbied governments, colonial governments, to provide schools to educate their children so their people could survive. So point there is sometimes peoples recognize the need to change and recognize another culture as something they need. Another example, 1823, India. The East India Company, the British East India Company wants to build a college in which Hindu, Sanskrit, classical culture would be revived and propagated. So the Brits in this case want to put resources behind classical native Indian culture. But a social reformer, a Hindu social reformer, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, writes to the Governor-General Lord Amherst and says, look, we in India don't need any more, and these are his words, benighted Hindu culture. We need European science, please. And that's what you need to be bringing us, because we recognise that in terms of science, chemistry, etc., Europe is superior. We need to learn and, in the end, equal you. But we can't equal you without learning. So the idea that whatever Europeans brought was resented by native peoples and was hoisted on them by force is largely nonsense. But yes, Europeans sometimes were insensitive and too dismissive. So it was complicated, morally speaking. But I certainly the
Well, when
notion.
we're evaluating,
Sorry. Say again.
go ahead. No, you
No.
finish.
Okay. Just to finish the general point, it's a widespread notion nowadays that it is immoral, wrong, inappropriate ever to suggest that, let's say, Western civilization was superior to other cultures. And that seems to me to be absurd. And there are plenty of non-Westerners in the 1800s who would have agreed it was absurd. But by the way, Western culture didn't develop in a kind of silo. I mean, you may have noticed that the religion that has dominated the European West and the American West was Christianity. Where did that come from? Not Europe. It came from the Middle East. And the guy who founded it, Jesus, didn't speak a European language. He spoke Hebrew, or Aramaic rather. And his skin colour, no, it wasn't white. It was probably rather brown. And so Western civilization is not purely Western. It itself has been, like all cultures, it's been involved in a negotiation and a giving and taking from other cultures. So we need to get out of this habit of, as it were, a kind of binary habit of black versus white or West versus the rest. Historically, it's far more complicated than that, and frankly, far more interesting.
Well, how then should we evaluate historical actors? I mean, you emphasize both intent and effect, right? Because if we evaluate them entirely on intent, my guess is that all of them thought they were doing the right thing, right? So it's difficult to focus entirely on intent. I mean, as a moral theologian, I mean, do you have to take both of those things into consideration? And I think others would say, don't even waste your time evaluating the actors, right? Really just evaluate the systems. It's not the imperialists that are the problem. It's imperialism that's the problem.
Great. So remind me to come shortly to the issue of system. First of all, intention and effects. Well, I'm not a utilitarian. I don't think you can. Well, there may be very simple cases where weighing up good and bad effects tells you which action was right and which was wrong. On the whole, it's far too complicated. And in my own book, on page 276, the reader gets to read a whole list of the bad things that the British Empire presided over. Then on page 277 is faced with a longer list, as it happens, of good things. And I say, we can't tell which of these lists weighed more heavily. I mean, how do you weigh against each other racial prejudice against the worldwide emancipation of slaves? Which weighs more heavily? How do you weigh the suppression of intertribal violence in Africa or Australia against, which was a good thing, it's good to stop people killing each other, against the inevitable cultural disruption when modernity hit these unmodern cultures? How do you say one weighs more heavily than the other? You can't do it. So I don't think, as a rule, that weighing up effects tells you what's right and what's wrong. And the other thing is, yes, without a doubt, probably the most destructive effect of European colonialism was the transmission of disease, which, according to Alan Taylor, I think certainly Taylor is a highly respected historian of America, and he wrote a book they call American Colonies, and I think in there he says it's been estimated that in a 50-year period when a Native American people had been subject to successive epidemics of disease, their population on average would decline by 90%. Devastating. And the same in Australia. So Europeans transmitted disease. This was a terrible effect. It wasn't intended. There are a couple of instances, perhaps, of attempts to wage biological warfare against Native Americans, but those were isolated instances. On the whole, the transmission of disease was entirely unintended. But take into account the fact that it's not only Europeans who spread disease. There's evidence that smallpox reached the northern part of Australia by means of Indonesian fishermen. And as for COVID, recently, didn't come from Europe. Nor did the Black Death, by the way. So the transmission of disease has terrible effects. Most of the time, no one does it deliberately. And therefore, no one can be blamed. It's a tragic fact. And as for motive and intention,
colonialism as a disease, similarly, as a something where there's no individual intent, but rather economic forces that drive this.
No, you can't do that. I mean, we'll come on the system in a moment. I mean, as I point out in the very first chapter of my book, which is just called Motives, though motives good and bad. The motives for British Empire were dozens of different motives, and many of them were quite innocent. Trade was a major one. Sometimes the suppression of slavery was another. So there are a whole host of motives, and I think in judging the empire, you have to take into account it was highly complex. I mean, it lasted 400 years, 4 centuries, from 1550 to 1960 thereabouts. It covered territory from Newfoundland to New Zealand, different circumstances, different times, in different places, at different times, different motives, different intentions, different effects. And so trying to make an overall judgment that I do is quite difficult. So coming to the point you make about system, regardless of individual motives and intentions, can we say the system was at heart wicked? Well, in a sense, the system is not entirely divorced from human intentions. I mean, human beings create systems. They may then become oblivious to the motives and intentions, as it were, incarnated in the system. But human beings can be responsible and culpable for creating a system that is full of immoral motives and intentions, even if they've forgotten about them. So I do, in trying to make an overall moral judgment in the conclusion to my book, having said that a utilitarian weighing up of effects is not going to do the trick, I then say, well, could we say that the empire was at heart vicious? So that it doesn't really matter what good effects it had, but because its heart was just black. And that's what a lot of critics at the moment try to do. They try to say the British Empire was really not distinguishable from Nazism. Churchill was not distinguishable from Hitler. And that's why they talk about roads and genocide, or roads and concentration camps. And so the Nazi Empire is perhaps a good example, and there are others. We might think the Stalinist Empire was equivalent, where no matter the good effects, the heart was in some sense rotten and wicked, racist, murderously racist, so murderously racist that the Nazis devoted military resources to liquidating the Jews in the middle of a world war. Such was their intent. Such was the resolve to eliminate Jewry in Europe. So I do ask, was the British Empire of that kind? And the reader must judge for herself my judgment, and my judgment is no. There's nothing in the history of the British Empire that was equivalent to Nazism. So we can't say it was rotten at the core. It had multiple motives. And then I go on to say that we can say in certain respects, and I can spell this out if you wish, Greg, the empire experienced a kind of a progression in virtue as time went on. And that's how I make an overall moral judgment. So yes, question of system is important. And a lot of people will say, well, what was wrong about the system was it was centrally racist, and there was at the heart of the British Empire this notion of the hierarchy of races with the whites at top and everyone else at the bottom. It was white supremacist. You can't say that. Yes, some Brits thought that. Other Brits thought very differently. There was no single view of how to view other races. And was it all about economic exploitation, as Marxists or neo-Marxists say? No, it wasn't. And there are economic historians who will say it wasn't. I could go on.
Now, you started this project called the Ethics and Empire Project, and I guess there's a burgeoning discipline called Empire Studies, but it seems like they focus primarily on these European empires, like the British Empire, and they don't focus on, say, the Comanche Empire or the Zulu Empire or some of the other empires that were vanquished by European empires. Why is that? I mean, do we focus on the evils of our own empires and not some of these other empires, at least within Western historical studies?
Another great question. So just to be clear, my critics keep on saying that the Ethics and Empire Project was designed to defend the British Empire. It never was, and the online description made clear from the beginning it never was. It was designed, in fact, to look at empire from ancient China to the modern period, and to consider how ancient Chinese or medieval Muslims viewed the empires of their own day in moral terms. That was the aim of that project. Now, as for why this focus on European empires, you're quite right. There is the focus on European empires, on white empires. No one cares about the Zulus or the Comanche. No one cares about China and Tibet right now. Or the informal Chinese empire in terms of the domination of resources in Africa, oddly. So why the focus on European empires? Well, that's a matter for speculation. My informed speculation is that, and this goes back to my earlier point, it's really about the record of the West. That's why we're focusing there. What's under scrutiny is the record of the West, and it's similar, I think, to the claim in your own country, Greg, the 1619 Project, the idea that America from its foundation was racist, and therefore the whole system is wicked. And when after the killing of George Floyd in 2020, Black Lives Matter crossed the Atlantic in Britain, we didn't do slavery in Britain, but our sin became slavery in the Caribbean and in the American colonies up until the time we abolished it. And the claim is that colonialism equals slavery. This is a use of colonial history to substantiate the claim that Britain is systemically racist, and the fact we have statues to Cecil Rhodes or whoever it is, colonial heroes or figures, is because we worship racist figures, and that's why we are racist. And that's the exploitation of history by what I'll call professional anti-racists. So there's a political motive for this. Now, I don't think, I've no reason to suppose that these professional anti-racists, these decolonizers in the West, are being funded by Russia or China. No reason to suppose that. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, although I'm open to being persuaded. But there's no doubt that at a time when, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, the West is under threat and pressure from Russia and China, this internal critique, and the critique is indiscriminate. I mean, it's unrelenting. I mean, there's no black and white. This critique is politically really dangerous. But it is the focus on European empires, I think, is because this is an attack on the West, and it's designed to. It's part of the story that the UK, like the US, is systemically racist, and I think I'm glad to report that there are Black Britons who disagree with that vigorously, and I think there's plenty of evidence to disagree with the contemporary claim as well as the historical claim. We can't identify colonialism as slavery, since the British Empire spent the second half of its life abolishing the damn thing.
Well, I think you speculate as a theologian that perhaps this sensibility has its origins in Christianity, right? The idea that our way of being righteous is to be aware of our unrighteousness, and that barbarism is Europe's great pride. I guess that's quoting Pascal Bruckner.
Yes.
Do you have a special perspective on this as a theologian?
Yes, I do. I mean, I guess it does strike me that the decolonizing narrative, I'm inclined to use the word woke because I think we all know what we're talking about, but it's not a scientific term. The narrative, as it were, I mean, if one's being charitable, I mean, the concern for social justice is admirable. And there's a kind of passionate intensity to the concern for social justice that one can find in the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures, and you can certainly find in Jesus himself. I mean, look at the language he uses toward the Pharisees. I mean, he doesn't pull his punches in terms of justice. So that's there. But what is missing is any restraint. So my own personal experience, and I'm not whining about being a victim here, but my own personal experience has been that some people on the other side, some people with the word professor in front of their name, some people at universities as prestigious as Cambridge can be vituperative and abusive because people like me, we are simply wicked, simply corrupt, and we are to be fought with no holds barred. So there's a lack of self-restraint, and the impression I get is, I'm the unrighteous because I think that European colonialism wasn't all racist and wicked, and those who are attacking me, they're the righteous, and boy do they feel it. Boy do they feel it. So you have a strong sort of Manichaean, righteous versus unrighteous, and that's where it's not Christian, because the Christian knows, even if the Christian is right, the Christian who on this issue is right, the Christian too is a sinner. And when Christians, I'm talking the way it should be, it's not always that way, but in my view, when a Christian, even who is on a particular matter is morally right, is criticizing or combating someone else who is morally wrong, both parties have this in common. They're both sinners. And all of us, in the Christian view, are capable of abusing other people, and all of us have done it. So that ought to restrain the way in which we treat wrongdoers. And one could say this restraint is a form of forgiveness or a form of compassion. So in Christianity properly, you have a concern for social justice as well as it were, a certain self-critical perspective, and therefore a certain compassion even for wrongdoers. And it's that latter self-critical dimension and the compassion and forgiveness that follows from it that is completely lacking on the side of the woke decolonizers. And there's a mercilessness about their behaviour that is quite frightening. And it's designed to be intimidating, and that's why lots of people who don't agree with them keep their mouth shut because they don't want to attract the same kind of aggression. And that's exactly what it's designed to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also mentioned that perhaps this anti-colonial movement is, in some sense, a new form of racism because it obscures the agency of the colonized people. So how could you say that? I mean, that seems, I think that's probably one of the things that's going to encounter quite a bit of opposition, right? So you, in the paperback edition of the book Colonialism, you say there's an extra 70 pages of critiques and responses to those critiques. I was wondering if you could tell us, like, what were the biggest critiques that you encountered and what were your responses to them?
Yeah, so in the postscript, first of all, I add some material on the first British Empire in Ireland and North America because I realised I hadn't really focused much on that. So there's more on your part of the world than there was in the first edition. But then, yes, most of it's given over to my answering the 10 most hostile reviews my book has received. One of the most common critiques is that I get racism wrong, that the empire was racist. As I say, it subscribed to a notion of a hierarchy of races, and that This places white people on top forever and non-white people below, and this was racist. And my response to many of my critics is that's far too crude. And I think we need to have an adult discussion about what we mean by racism. And in my book, I discriminate different forms of racism. I mean, there can be, as it were, a kind of soft racial prejudice which is born of arrogance. I mean, the Brits were perfectly capable of being arrogant when they were at the height of their power. I mean, if I may say so, Americans at the height of their power could be arrogant. And I've noticed President Xi is not very humble. So people who are at the top of their game are vulnerable to arrogance, and Brits were, and that could express itself in humiliating behaviour toward native peoples. And then, at the worst end, there is this white supremacist notion that white people are biologically, genetically destined to rule the world. But in between, there's another view which many British people adhere to, and that is that yes, European civilization is superior to cultures in Africa, North America, and India, Australasia, in certain important respects, and that it is therefore the job of Europeans, the white man's burden, to help these other peoples develop culturally, and that's why you had schools teaching native kids. But the view of people of other races behind this is as follows: they are the same as us. They have the same potential. Culturally, in certain respects, they're underdeveloped, but in principle, they can become our equals. And so, at one point, Cecil Rhodes in the Parliament of Cape Colony in 1894, he talks about the Africans being like children. They're coming out of barbarism, which we may regard as racist language. But then in the next sentence he says, I do not believe they're different from ourselves. I do not believe they're different from ourselves. Our job is to help them become more developed. There is that view. In my view, that's not racist at all. And as I said earlier, Greg, you can find native peoples in all parts of the world who recognise that in certain respects what Europeans brought was valuable, and they wanted it. So they had agency. They didn't want all of it, and they didn't necessarily want white men to hang around and rule them forever. But they were, like the rest of us, we can all discriminate. We can all see there are certain things other people have got that we want. We might feel humiliated a bit that we have to ask for it, but if we're adult, we'll get over that and learn to absorb what's good and reject what's bad. And of course, when Africans, for example, adopted Christianity, and no, it wasn't forced down their throats, it couldn't have been because the missionaries couldn't do it, but when Africans adopted Christianity, what do? They adapted it. African Christianity is not the same as Christianity in England, which is what we'd expect. So yes, there was agency, and native peoples weren't just the passive victims. They recognised unequal power, but they played it, sometimes successfully.
Well, Nigel, thank you so much for joining me. We talked about colonialism. We didn't talk about your other books, What's Wrong with Rights in Defense of War and so on. So perhaps we can do that some other time. The book is called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning.
Thanks very much, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.